How's it going, everyone? Vlad here with SolisPLC.com, and welcome back to yet another technical tutorial in which we're going to be focusing on this CompactLogix, Allen Bradley, or Rockwell Automation PLC. And the reason for that being is because we get a lot of questions from our students as to what is the most cost-effective way to start programming in RSLogix or Studio 5000. And I believe that this CompactLogix specifically is a very solid option for a number of reasons. That being said, in this tutorial, we're going to be covering how to connect to that PLC, how to set the IP address, how to also power the PLC using a power supply. So we're going to be getting you up to speed on everything you need to get started, and hopefully you'll learn a thing or two along the way. So stay tuned, and we're going to be discussing a lot when it comes to this PLC, programming in general, and hopefully make you a better programmer of control systems. All right, so here is our PLC on the table. I'm going to be giving you a little bit of an overview before we power on the PLC. So this is an Allen Bradley, as you can see here, CompactLogix PLC with the label of L18ERM. This is not the cheapest model within that lineup, so I'm going to be bringing up the data sheet on the screen. So the L16 without the M, which stands for motion, is going to be your cheapest option. That being said, I was able to pick up this PLC for a relatively cheap or inexpensive price. And the reason for that being is that they thought there was a default based on the program that was loaded on the PLC. So they essentially sold it for parts, but it is a perfectly functioning PLC. So I want to point out a couple of things. So first of all, there's going to be the label on the side here, which you can read and ultimately get the PLC number from the side of the PLC and be able to identify a couple of things we're going to look at a little bit later in this video, but it allows you to go on the website and research your specific part number. On the front side, of course, we have the same iconic lights that we see behind me on the screen for some of the other PLCs, including the ControlLogix that tell you what the status is. We also have this opening door that will allow you to insert an SD card here on the top slot and switch the current state of the PLC. As you can see, it's set in remote. It can be set to run by flipping the switch, or it can be set into program mode. I typically, once we have everything configured, leave it in remote. But if you're looking to configure certain settings, it will tell you explicitly what it needs to be in. And we might see that a little bit later once we start programming. The item right below it is the USB port. This is the old style USB adapter that you'd see in printers very frequently now. So we're going to be connecting using this port in just a moment. But ultimately, it allows you to connect via USB without knowing the IP address of this specific PLC. And as you'll notice here, there's going to be a label. Most of the time, it is not going to be labeled. And on these types of PLCs, unlike the ControlLogix, you don't have a scrolling window that will allow you to see what the IP address is set to. So the easiest way is to connect via USB port, set the IP address that you want, and then connect to it via Ethernet. Before we turn over to the ports on the bottom, I do want to mention there's going to be some inputs as well as some outputs on the PLC. These are going to be the indicator lights for that. And the ports for connecting those IOs are going to be right underneath here with the 4 blocks. So there's going to be 8 rows times 4, and that's going to be 8 rows times 4 plus some comments, and that's going to be mentioned in the data sheet, of course. We're also going to have an adapter for power, and again, we're going to connect into that shortly. It is an adapter that you can remove to make it easier to connect within the panel, but we're going to look in the data sheet and see exactly where we need to connect the 24 volts DC in order to power this PLC. On the bottom, if I can turn this over on its side, we'll see that there's going to be 2 Ethernet ports that we can connect to. And on this specific model, it's going to be the exact same IP address, meaning that you cannot set the port to an individual IP address. And we're going to turn this over once again. This is what you're going to see on the side, and this connector can be covered, but ultimately, obviously in an industrial environment, it makes sense. In this case, we can leave it open. This is where we can connect additional 1734 style IO that you typically see behind me. If I switch over to the other camera, you'll see that I have some of that point IO here on the back, which is covered in a tutorial video for SolisPLC. So you can snap that on if you need more inputs, outputs, or different than what's currently on the PLC, which is only digital. You can connect analog, you can connect a whole lot of different variations of that IO. So without any further delay, let's power on this PLC and try to go online via RSLogix through the USB port. All right, so there are many ways to find the technical manuals or the data sheets you're looking for. One of the ways that I typically approach this for a new device is I would search Allen Bradley on Google. You can then navigate to the official website, make sure that it's not any malware, because you're going to be downloading files, not only the data sheets, but also firmware. Make sure it is the legitimate Rockwell automation website. At this point, there's multiple ways, again, to navigate to the specific product that you're looking for, but we do have the part number that I showed you on the side of the screen. So in this case, I'm simply going to search the product that I'm looking for, and in this case, it's 1769-L18ERM, and I believe that you can also search for CompactLogix and navigate to it that way. But the first option that pops up should be the one that we're looking for. So there's a couple of things we're looking to confirm. So number one, the catalog number, as you can see, this is the updated model, which has the K. We have the one that is BB1B. That should be perfectly fine. They should be almost the same. I forgot what the K stands for, but it should be in the datasheet. You also have the life cycle status. Currently, it is active. This is something that you use to check the obsolescence of your product. So if a factory has something that is end of life or is discontinued, that is probably where you should start being concerned. That being said, if we scroll down, there's going to be a lot of different options or tabs you can click on. Ultimately, you can get the drawings that will show up. That is not what we're looking for right now. You can also click on the documents, and you'll see that there's going to be a couple of documents listed. So if I click on this product cut sheet, for example, it will bring me to the photo of the device as well as some of the specifications. This is definitely not what I need right now because I'm looking for the wiring diagram. So I can click on this technical data resource. So again, I can right click, open in a new tab. In this case, I can switch over to that tab, and we'll have a PDF which explains not only the product that we currently have on hand, but some of the other models. And it's extremely important to pay attention to this because they're going to offer different specifications, different I/O, different connection methods. So it is extremely important to understand this document. So we have a CompactLogix 5370L1 control system based on the diagram that you see here. If you're using something else, make sure to pay attention to what it is, because as you can see in this image, the I/O modules are definitely different, and so the specifications are going to be different. So if we scroll down, you'll notice that this specific data sheet talks a lot about different devices. So this is going to be the L16ER BB1B, the L18ER BB1B, which is the one that we currently have. There's going to be the L18ERM BB1BK, which is also the model, sorry, that's the model that we have because it has the ERM version. And so there's going to be a lot of different PLCs, as you can see here, the L24ER, the L30s. Long story short, we're not going to go into all of those details, but you should be confirming which module you are using and getting the right data for that specific PLC. If I keep scrolling down, you will notice that there's going to be a lot of information. There's going to be talks about the embedded I/O, about talks about the external I/O, about talks about temperature, accuracy. So there's going to be a lot of information, but I don't believe there's going to be a wiring sheet. So what I do need to go back to is that specific page, and you'll see that at the bottom there's going to be looking for more documentation. I can click on search the library, and so this should bring up a little bit more results than what we've been looking for. So there's going to be installation instructions, and usually that's what you're looking for and where you will find information on what to wire into the controller in order to get it to run. So I'm going to be once again clicking open this in a new tab. But before I do that, I want to mention that some of these manuals will be available in different languages as well. We're going to open the English one. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And obviously you can scroll through it and read in a lot of detail, but ultimately we want to figure out what to wire in. And you'll see here the controller parts that we've discussed a little bit earlier are going to be presented here. And what we're looking for is this part number 8, which is going to be the power removable terminal block. Connects external power supply to the controller. And I already know how to get this done, but ultimately we want to figure out what are the first steps to power this controller. And here you will see the instructions to do exactly that. So complete the following steps to connect the power supply to your 5370L1 control system. Verify that the external power supply is 24 volts DC, that it sits on a DIN rail. You can remove the block as I mentioned before, and you can wire in the power supply as shown here. So let's look at the connections. Again, they're specified and they're fairly straightforward, but we can see that the plus is going to the top pin. Then you have a minus that goes, it's a little bit ambiguous here with the cross, but ultimately it's plus, minus, and then plus, minus at the bottom terminals. So that is exactly what we're going to do here, except that I'm using a different power supply. I have a power supply from Phoenix Contact that we're going to be using. You can obviously choose a power supply of your choice. What I will mention, and this is a little bit of a side note because I know this question will ultimately come up and has come up a lot on Reddit and other sources, is can you use a cheap or very inexpensive power supply to power your control system? And the answer, of course, as long as it provides 24 volts DC at the right amperage, it should not be a problem. However, right, and this is the caveat that I always mention, is that not all power supplies are made equal, and I don't want to get into a lot of the electronics design classes that I've taken in university, but ultimately, you can have a bad power source, which will ultimately lead to harmonics on your devices, which will ultimately lead to bad power factor if you don't correct it, and ultimately that will degrade, or I guess get your electronics to die faster depending on how bad the power supply is. And I think just like with anything else in life, there is this cost to value ratio. So if you want to buy a slightly cheaper power supply, I think that is definitely an option. But if you're going to spend a very small amount on your power supply, expect there to be stranger things, or expect that power supply to fail easier. Expect maybe the PLC to behave a little bit differently if you have a power supply on which the voltages start to fluctuate because it's overheating, or it's an environment that doesn't necessarily work well. So I always advise to buy rated and power supplies from reputable manufacturers. If you have the PLC sitting in an industrial cabinet in your lab environment, you should be able to get away with slightly cheaper power supplies, because obviously you don't have the constraints of an industrial environment. But I would still not purchase a power supply that is of a questionable quality level. All right, so here right next to the PLC, I have a 24 volts DC power supply from Phoenix Contact. As you can see at the bottom, I've already got a 110 feed plugged in. I currently have it unplugged until we make all the connections and we secure the PLC in place. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove the terminal to make this a little bit easier on myself. So we can simply unscrew the two screws here on the top and the bottom of this specific PLC in order to wiggle out the terminal. So all I need to do is I'm going to take the positive end and I'm going to screw that into the top terminal, as you can see here. And I'm going to screw in the terminal as you would expect in the field. Of course, this would be better of a connection if we put a crimp on it, but in a lab environment, once again, that doesn't really play a huge difference. We're also going to secure the negative terminal from the power supply, so that's going to go into the next slot, and I'm going to secure the connection just as I've done, and we should be done with this specific terminal. All that needs to be done is placing it back into the PLC, and we will secure the two terminals, one at the bottom and one at the top. And at this point, all I need to do is power on the power supply by plugging it into an outlet. At which point, if everything goes well, we should be seeing a lot of lights going through a cycle. As you can see here, right now we have a red OK light that is powered on. Not to worry, this should go on for a couple of seconds before the other LEDs come on and tell us that the status of this specific PLC should be okay. Good, and as you can see, within a couple of seconds, I want to say 20 to 30 seconds, the PLC is fully operational. We can now proceed. Again, as I've mentioned, we can either connect by Ethernet or we connect by USB. In my case, I want to connect by USB in order to find out what the IP address is and set the IP address to what I want on my specific network. All right, so at this point, we have the PLC connected via the USB port into my laptop. So what I can do here is I can type in my search and go into RSLinks Classic. There's certainly different flavors of RSLinks open right now. You can launch whichever version you're currently using. I believe that the newer one has a nicer interface, but ultimately the drivers are going to be very similar. So once RSLinks Classic opens up, we can definitely look through all of our drivers. As you can see, I have quite a few of them, but ultimately the PLC that we're looking for is going to be under USB. And what you will notice is some of the older PLCs that I've already connected to in the past, what it should find is the PLC that is currently connected. Typically, I give this a little bit of a moment. It can take from a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes, depending again on the version, on your USB cable, of course, on your hardware, as well as the PLC you're trying to connect to. But it's ultimately going to perform a scan of that specific port. And I believe in my case, it's also trying to find a lot of different devices on that specific network, which is why it can be slow at specific times. So what I'm going to find here is the exact PLC name that we've been looking at this entire time, which is the 1769 L18 ERM-BB1B CompactLogix processor. If I select this, I can expand this, and obviously if the PLC is connected over the network, you should be able to drill down into different cards, different IO modules, and that's typically what you'd want to see in a live production system. So here's going to be that A Ethernet port. You'll notice that it's a little bit slow again on my side for browsing to this. You shouldn't be seeing this if you are connecting to a server or to a machine that has different settings. That being said, what I can do here is I can right click this specific module and I should be able to change the IP address. So if I right click and go into device configuration, it should give me the port IP address of the specific device. So in this case, you'll notice that there's going to be port configuration. There's going to be only one port, despite there being two physical ports at the bottom of the PLC. And as I mentioned, that's because you're going to be setting the port IP address to be identical for both ports, meaning that you could daisy chain the PLC, but you cannot set the different IP addresses on each port, which is a possibility with different flavors of CompactLogix PLCs. Some of the ones that you see typically behind me have that capability. That being said, there's going to be three options. DHCP, you're going to rarely see that if you have a server that's going to dynamically assign IP addresses. BootP, which is what typically these devices come as factory default, and you're going to have manually configure IP address, which is what I'm going to be using. So what I have here inside of my environment, in my lab, I have a private IP address network. So I'm going to look at my spreadsheet and I'm going to assign an IP address to my device in order to then connect to it via RSLogix, and in this case, Studio 5000. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, you'll notice that the PLC is definitely running. We're able to configure the port. We're able to look at the two ports that are currently enabled, and we're able to set the IP address to whatever you need that PLC to look at. I'm going to look at my device spreadsheet and I'm going to set the IP address. And the last thing that I want to show you is if I cancel out of this, the other item that I want to be looking at is, so you can see there's device properties, we had module configuration, you can look at statistics, and you can look at properties. What you will find here is a very important piece of information, which is the revision of Studio or RSLogix 5000 that you'll need. This specific PLC only runs Studio, so that's not going to be a problem. However, you need to match the version of your Studio 5000 installation to the revision of this specific PLC, which in this case is 30 with the minor revision 11. And currently I'm running version 36, which means that we will need to install a firmware on this PLC, and we're going to take care of that step next, which is what we can accomplish using the Control Flash firmware or software from Allen Bradley. In this case, we're going to launch a version that is 15.03. Once again, there's been new releases of the software, so your interface might look different, but it should accomplish essentially the same thing, which is sending the firmware from your computer to the PLC, matching it to what you have as the Studio 5000 environment. And what we're looking for here is the PLC. As you can see here, you can select from a variety of different options. There's going to be the ControlLogix series, the CompactLogix series, there's going to be drives, there's going to be panel views, and depending on what you have installed, we'll see that in just a moment, you will have different versions of firmware on your specific machine in your installation. Once again, I need to find the PLC in order to confirm the location of the flash. So I'm going to select USB and it should rebrowse the PLCs, allowing me to select the exact specific hardware that I will be flashing with the software. And so here, just as we've seen before, I can select the PLC, which is that L18 ERM controller, and I can press on OK once the selection is made. Control Flash will not allow you to flash a firmware revision to a PLC that does not match the specific configuration, and you will have a confirmation of what the current revision is, what the serial number is, as well as the catalog number that I've mentioned a couple of times. Now you'll notice the problem here is I've mentioned that I have revision 36 of Studio 5000. In this case, I'm only being presented with version 30. If I show all revisions, you'll notice that I also have version 24 as well as version 20 of Studio 5000 firmware for this specific PLC. It's important to know that in order to get those revisions, we will need to go back to the Rockwell Automation website and download that specific firmware. So before we flash anything, which again does not match the version that I'm looking for, we need to go back to that website and download the firmware and install that. So once we are back on the website, the steps are going to be fairly similar to what we've done before. We'll need to go into downloads. In this case, I'm looking for drivers and firmware, so I can click on that specific button and I'll be able to search once again for what I need for this specific device. I prefer to search by part number, so 1769 L18 ERM. And as you'll see, there's going to be both variations. There's the K as well as the one without the K version. We're going to have to select a series, and that's going to be on the listing. So I have series B of this specific controller. I just looked on the label on the side like I've shown you at the beginning of this video, and we're going to be looking at the different versions. You'll notice there's going to be a red triangle besides the ones that are no longer supported or have issues. There's going to be a gray one besides the ones that are a bit older, and there's going to be a green triangle next to the versions that we should be using based on Rockwell's recommendation. In this case, I'm looking for that 36 with the small revision or the minor revision version 11. So I'm going to select that. All right, so we will be flashing our PLC using the Control Flash Plus tool. I have done a little bit of testing, and ultimately version 36 does not seem to cooperate with the very old Control Flash software that I had running on my other computer. So I switched over to this virtual machine that runs version 36 of Studio 5000 and ultimately runs Control Flash Plus. So what we're going to do here first is we're going to browse to the device I have replugged in over USB at this specific computer, and we should be able to browse to that device on the same way that we've done through RSLinks. It is slightly a newer interface, so something for you to see. And ultimately, once we go into the USB, you'll notice that we have that same PLC that we've been talking about. So what I'm going to be doing here is clicking on OK, and we're going to see if the firmware is available. If not, I'm going to have to transfer that file over. So you'll notice that here we are looking that in device we have version 30 like we've talked about before. I want to look at the latest on the computer. It doesn't seem to let me browse to the specific version that I'm looking for, which is not the right configuration. But you'll also see that the device is not in the right configuration, which is that little switch that I've talked to you about. So it is not in the correct mode to be flashed. So I'm going to switch that over and we're going to look at the firmware. So once I flip the switch to program mode on the PLC, I don't currently have it sitting next to me on the desk. It is across the room next to that different computer. I have the option to select the different firmware revision for that PLC, and the version that I'm looking for is 36 with the minor revision to be 11. So I'm going to click on next once I'm happy with that selection. You will get a warning for one device. Read and understand all warnings. So of course, this is going to be a fairly sensitive, I want to say, operation. Once we close this warning, I believe that we should be able to say flash, because I do not have any secure SD card in place. And we're going to patiently wait for this to complete. If everything goes well, you will notice a flash attempted 1 and succeeded 1 notification at the very end. And we also see that the device now has version 36 loaded into it. At this point, we can launch Studio 5000 and connect to our PLC. So what I'm going to do here is search for Studio 5000. I'm going to create a new project, and this is going to be test 1. Again, that is not extremely relevant. This is going to be a CompactLogix 5370 PLC L18ERM BB1B. C, new folder, that's fine. Let's create it just to test everything is looking good. We don't have any expansion IO. We don't need any permission, so we'll put that as 0 modules. Press on finish, and that should create a blank project for our specific PLC. I did not end up changing the IP address, but it could be something that we tackle in the next project. I show you everything that needs to be done in RSLogix and RSLinks in order to do just that. And if everything goes well, if we can go online with this PLC, we can connect it over Ethernet. That should not be a problem, but currently we are still going over USB. So let's just select the path. I don't believe it will automatically create that for us. So I'm going to open USB, select this PLC, and I'm going to hit on go online. The firmware revision flash should have wiped the memory entirely, so that should not be any issue whatsoever. I'm going to click on download. Good, so now that we are on the PLC in Studio 5000, we can start creating programs. As you can see here, we already have a main routine laid out for us with an empty rung. Obviously, we can also scroll down all the way at the bottom under the Ethernet section. We can double click the PLC. I'm going to be renaming this, so this is not really a problem or the final result. We can also go into Internet Protocol, give this an IP address, and connect over the Ethernet network that is part of my lab or home environment. All right, so that concludes our tutorial on the CompactLogix series PLC. We've looked at how to power on the PLC. We've looked at the data sheet for the PLC. We've looked at where to find the firmware. We've ultimately used control flash to flash the firmware of our controller to version 36, minor revision 11. We've connected to it with Studio 5000 environment. We've looked at the very basic logic structure that you get in your first project. So if you have any questions on any of those topics, make sure to leave them in the comments down below. Let me know what other videos you would like for us to create, make, or some of the questions you'd like for us to answer. You can always find us on the website, SolisPLC.com. You can also reach out to me directly on my LinkedIn page with the URL also in the comment section, as well as the description for this video. But in any case, that's all for today, and we'll see you next time.